So, and this is something that's actually a little bit trickier to pull off in an adventure, but I want to talk about it a bit, is your villains need to be both visibly proactive and reactive. And what I mean by that is a villain needs to be doing something throughout the adventure. I think some of the less successful villains are ones that sort of are placed in the bottom of the dungeon and they're sitting there doing nothing until the adventurers show up to foil their plans or whatever, and don't actually do anything throughout the course of the adventure. Your villains should have a plan that they're putting in motion, and the players need to see that plan unfolding in some way. By the same token, as the adventure progresses, your players are going to mess with those plans. They're going to kill henchmen and find the MacGuffin and things like that. And what your villain needs to be able to do is your villain needs to be able to react to that in some visible way. Maybe this means a certain encounter comes up that is directly related to what the players have done earlier. A good villain in an adventure, you can feel his hand at work behind the scenes from adventure's beginning till the conclusion when you finally deal with him. And I think this is actually one of the trickiest things to pull off in a published pre-written adventure, because you can't necessarily account for every eventuality. But in your home adventures, how your party is likely to react, so you can prepare a few side encounters and things like that. The best villains, though, they have both the means and the will to do bad things to your players and to do things that are a direct reaction to your players' actions. So, for example, the players break into the secret warehouse that's owned by the villain and steal his magic sword that he's going to use to perform some ritual. Well, at that point, the players have directly interfered with the villain's plan. Your villain needs to be able to reach out and react to that. Maybe he sends assassins to kill the players and steal the artifact back, or maybe he sends a huge bribe of treasure to basically try and pay off the heroes to get the MacGuffin sword back. At that point, the villain has done something, and it doesn't have to be a direct face-to-face interaction, but he's done something, and your players realize that there's another force working against them. Basically, there's tension created between villain and hero whenever the villain seems to be actively doing things. So I think picking out ways for villains to create encounters in actual mechanical terms, or finding ways for the villain to act in a visible way to the players just helps reinforce how memorable they are. You want to talk about Carl Nemency some more?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I got another one.
Yeah, all right. He's got a million of them.
All right. As an example, again, from the campaign that I'm running, there's a villain I created that I created him back at the start of the campaign as one of the huge arcs of my ongoing campaign, and I knew he wouldn't show up for a long, long time, but I introduced him very early, and the villain's name is Vantajar. He is a pirate warlord who starts the campaign in prison. He's been imprisoned by the government, he's been locked away, and basically sequestered and forgotten. Early in the campaign, the characters launched an assault against another villain's stronghold, completely independent of this Vantajar guy, and things did not go well. The characters ended up being knocked unconscious and captured. I did something to one of the characters, who happens to be Rodney's character. I had these clerics basically rip out one of his eyes and replace it with this magic item that basically fits in your eye socket, called an Eye of Vengeance. And then I had these bad guys put these guys on a prison ship and send them off toward the prison, with him acting as courier, because the eye was meant to go to Vantajar, who lost his in battle before he was imprisoned. This was going to be a weapon that he was going to use in the future. Well, they managed to get out of that situation and escape the prison ship, and so the eye was never delivered. But what I created in that instant was a conflict between his character and a villain he wasn't going to see for another 15 levels, who eventually gets bought out of prison. The Temple of Tiamat basically pays to have him released, to use him for some foul purpose. And one of the first things he wants to do when he gets out, go after him. Exactly. He wants his eye back.
This is an example of a much more limited specific adventure situation where the villain can be proactive. In the 3rd edition adventure, Heart of Nightfang Spire, I had the villain scribe all these glyphs around this place he lived in and wanted to protect. And anytime an adventurer would walk into a room with one of these glyphs, he could just scry it and know it. And basically, he could just mess with them as he willed within the confines of the adventure construct itself. So that made it a DM could do as much as he or she wanted to have the villain interact with the players as they went along.
Yeah, Chris's villain Vantajar is actually a really good example of several of the different traits that we've talked about so far. He's got the motivation, right? He wants to get his weapon, the eye, out of my character's head. Thanks, by the way. He wants to get his eye. He's got memorable traits. He's missing one eye. He's a pirate warlord, very visually distinctive. And then he, or at least people acting on his behalf, are both proactive and reactive. Proactive in that they captured my character, put the eye of vengeance in his head. Reactive in that once my character escaped that situation, they continued to pursue my character. Like we just recently found out that they've been using rituals to find out where my character is and send basically hit squads out to get the eye back, right? It's a good example of how the villain, we actually haven't even met Vantajar face-to-face yet, right? But it's a great example of how, even without meeting the villain face-to-face, you can feel that villain's hand at work. And it's something that I think really helps to make the final conflict with the villain that much more satisfying for players, is that they feel this tension that builds over the course of an adventure, or in our case, over 15 levels worth of adventure. But they feel that conflict and that tension building as a result of all these interactions with the villain's plots and plans. And then when finally you get to that point, it feels like you're actually accomplishing something when you defeat the villain who has thrown monkey wrenches in your plans, ripped out your eye, et cetera, over the course of the campaign. So just something to think about. And we already sort of covered this a little bit, but a good villain interacts with the heroes multiple times throughout the adventure. This doesn't have to be direct. It could be indirectly, like we talked about, sending hit squads or bribes, etc. But it actually can be direct as well. Now, obviously the big pitfall is, well, as soon as the players see the villain, they're going to attack him and kill him, or attack him and get TPK'd or whatever. So I actually like to use a lot of different methods for the players and the villain to communicate that don't actually allow for physical interaction. And a good example is the players might interact with the villain through a magic mirror. They can communicate both ways, or sending stones is something we have in 4th edition, where basically they communicate verbally and they can actually talk to the villain and see the villain if it's a magic mirror. I've used a villain who just projected an illusion of himself that could, he could talk back and forth with them. And those are ways that your players can speak to the villain, interact with him. I know a lot of times it's really easy, especially in a published adventure, for you to build up a really cool backstory and a really cool villain that the players never really get, because their interaction is kick down the door, there's the villain, he starts to monologue, and they're like, forget it, blah, and attack, right? So creating different ways for the villain to speak to the players, like actually having role-playing encounters between villain and PC can be tricky to pull off, but when you do it, it does sort of the same thing that the encounters, the assassins, etc. do, only it also lets you really play up that character's personality. I mean, frankly, you look at a villain like Magneto. I use that one all the time because he's like my favorite villain. But half of the really cool stuff that Magneto does isn't throwing around nuclear missiles or lifting asteroids up into space. It's his interactions with the X-Men, or his interactions with Professor X. So if you can find ways to make that happen, it really ends up being very satisfying for the players.
Let's see if I can encapsulate a bunch of ideas concisely here. You kind of have to decide when you create a villain how brave you feel about actually putting that villain in front of the characters for real. If you put a villain in the room with the characters and he or she is actually there, you do have to prepare for the likelihood that that villain will not get out of that situation and die. And you can accept that, and that's perfectly fine. I have certainly put my villains out there, and I like to put them out there because then they're a real threat to the characters. But I always think about, does this villain have an out? Or if this villain gets whacked, who's going to step up and take his place? What henchman do I have backing up the villain who has enough personality that that henchman could take that villain's place? Case in point, again going back to my campaign, I had a villain who was a tiefling crime lord named Zybon Krinvaj. And basically he was running all the bad stuff happening in this city called Isle Galaroth. I knew that he was going to be the type of, he is a confrontational villain. He's a big giant tiefling guy who likes to like throttle his enemies. His power is this strangle ability because he likes to be up close strangling people he doesn't like. So I knew that there was a good chance he was going to die. So I gave him sort of a Bondian henchman named Prismius, who was this tiefling that he got out of jail long ago, who felt absolutely loyal and obliged to do whatever Zybon told him to do. But he was tortured in prison, and his face was horribly scarred by acid. So he was this kind of mutilated tiefling guy. Party did end up whacking Zybon in their, I guess, second encounter with him. And Prismius stepped up and became Zybon's replacement and started to try to wrangle Zybon's organization under him. Not quite doing it as well as Zybon, but he really kind of stepped up and became a threat in and of himself. So that was a case where I had a backup villain at the ready. Other times, I try to create villains with outs. For instance, a dragonborn lich, who, of course, if you destroy him, is not completely gone from the campaign. Because with a lich, you specifically have a way to bring that guy back. His phylactery basically ensures that the lich can reform and come back later. And then the problem becomes for the characters, if we're going to get rid of this guy for good, we have to find his phylactery. In the case of the Dragonborn Lich, the phylactery was hidden in a hurdy-gurdy organ, but they still found it and eventually destroyed him, but he got to reappear a couple times, basically because he had that out. Another good out for a villain is put some ramifications in front of the characters that say, if you kill this villain, bad things may happen. For instance, a villain who's very well connected politically. There is a villain in the campaign who is basically the head of the government secret police, Colonel Kygar. If the characters kill him, and the players know this, the repercussions to that party will be extreme. They will essentially be enemies of the Empire. So his political weight means that the characters have to give serious thought before killing him. They can thwart his plans, they can get under his skin, but if they kill him, they understand the campaign is going to take a very big turn, and the characters are probably going to be on the run from a lot more people than they want to deal with.
Yeah, so by now you guys have heard about like 6 or 7 different villains in Chris's campaign, and he's barely scratching the surface, so that should give you guys an idea what kind of DM he is. This is something I want to talk about just really briefly. In D&D, oftentimes our villains are actually monstrous. So one of the things you want to think about is making what we would think of as just a monster into a villain. For example, everybody loves mind flayers. They're awesome and creepy. I know Bruce really likes mind flayers as well. They're awesome and creepy, and they're often used as, creatures in an encounter, but there's no reason why you can't take a monster like a mind flayer and turn them into a villain just by the application of many of the traits we've talked about here. So you can often save yourself a lot of time and effort by picking out a monster that you think is really cool, like a mind flayer. A doppelganger is another one I like to use occasionally, and basically apply this process that we've talked about to that monster, and all of a sudden they get elevated from normal monster up to actual villain. So here's that. Oh yeah. Oh no.